Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA. Welcome. This is a special webinar brought to you by the Miami Valley section of APA, and I guess a quick plug for them too. They are taking a call for sessions for their annual, I think it might be the 37th annual Planning and Zoning Workshop, which is the first Friday in December. So you can still get a session proposal in. I think it's till the 25th. Visit our website, ohioplanning.org, to learn more about that. And I believe they're also taking sponsors. So feel free to take a look at that. Also, our state conference is coming up at the end of September, September 24th, 25th, 26th in the great city of Toledo. And registration is open. I'm actually just about to drop our preliminary program onto the website and in your inbox, so watch for that. And if you are planning to attend, make sure that you book your hotel by September 1st. I could be wrong. It might be soon. Actually, I think it is sooner than that. It might also be the 25th of August. Head over to ohioplanning.org/conference to get all the info that you need and to register. If you have any questions for Daryl, who's going to be talking today about short-term rentals, you can type them in the Q&A box. We'll see if we'll get to those at the end, if we have enough time. If not, I'll be sending your questions and your contact info over to Daryl, and then he can follow up with you. So with that, Daryl, self-introduce. And
thank you.
kind of kick things off, and I'll be here in the background kind of watching that Q&A box if anyone has any questions. We are recording this. A copy of the recording will be automatically sent to you all after the fact, and then it'll also be up on our website. So if you want to share it or view it again, you'll have that opportunity. And also, you can get 1 CM credit. I forgot to mention that. And all that info will be on our website as well if you need it. All right, Daryl.
Great. Thanks, Christine. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for the introduction. And I will also plug Miami Valley's workshop they do every year. I've been there. I've spoken there. It's phenomenal. So I encourage you all to get down there and see it in December. It's a great time. But my name is Daryl Wolnick. I am giving you a presentation today, as you see here, on short-term rentals, officially titled Understanding Effects and Regulations. We'll talk a lot about what short-term rentals do to communities, as well as some best practices and good ways to think about regulating them. I should say this is not all-encompassing. That would be a semester's worth of classes to give an all-encompassing discussion on something as intricate and difficult as short-term rentals are in housing and economics. But who am I? Let's see if I can get this to advance here. There we go. So that's what we're going to talk about. But who am I? And I'll come back to the other slide. I am a planning manager for a company called Verdantis, which, yes, is a totally made-up word. You may recognize us as a company we were before, which is CT Consultants. CT Consultants was based out of Mentor in Ohio, and we were bought by Verdantis and fully integrated at the beginning of this year. So now we are Verdantis. A little bit more about me. I've done planning all across the country, quite literally, in Utah and Colorado, now in Ohio, originally from Ohio. I've studied natural resources and tourism and city and metropolitan planning, and I tried to do a PhD, and it bored me. It was really not what I wanted to do, but I may finish it someday. My focus in my master's degree was on short-term rentals, and my doctoral work was, no surprise, also on short-term rentals, specifically their effects on collective efficacy and community development. So what are we going to do today? I'll go back to that slide there. We'll go through some background really quickly, how short-term rentals work, a bit of community and society, if you will, of short-term rentals, rent gap research, where short-term rentals pop up, and then what you're probably all here for, which is sample regulatory frameworks. We'll do a quick example if I can get through it. Christine alluded to this. If we have time for questions, I'm a bit of a talker. I tend to talk too much. So if you see me looking off screen a bit, it's to check myself via time to make sure I'm not spending too much on one topic. But we'll leave time for questions at the end, absolutely. So some very quick background. Short-term rentals have been around forever, right? Much longer than Airbnb, which is kind of ubiquitous as short-term rentals at this point. Airbnb, of course, is the digital platform that is used to actually rent out and find short-term rentals, conceived by literally some guy who was couch surfing while traveling to San Francisco. And he said, hey, this would be a great way to make money. people should be able to do this. We all know that, if we've ever traveled anywhere since as long as anyone can remember, there have been ski cabins and beach rentals and lake houses. Those things have been around longer, right? Is now we have a way to rent them very, very easily. The sharing economy, of course, made this much more popular. Apps like Uber, for example, are part of the sharing economy, or the gig economy, also, you can call it. Short-term rentals, or STRs, as you'll see throughout this presentation, are different than traditional rentals for the very basic reason that they are less than 30 days. Anything longer than 30 days, we call a long-term rental or a traditional rental housing. So how's it supposed to work, right? You're a homeowner. Maybe you're an empty nester. Maybe your kids are gone. Maybe you just have a big house and it's just you. Maybe you bought too much house, and you say, I have extra space that I want to use. I don't use it anymore. What can I do? I also want to make some extra money. Well, let's put two and two together. Let me go find somebody who can use that extra space for a short amount of time and also pay me for it. Airbnb came along and said, that's a great idea. Let's make this easier. We're going to be a third-party platform that scrapes money off the top and connects homeowners with customers who are just trying to use the extra space in their home that they're not currently using. Well, what happened? Capitalism got a hold of it, right? We want to make as much money as we can. And someone, or in areas where there's lots of tourism, some entity, company, purchases a property and lists it as a short-term rental only. So that is, as we'll see throughout this presentation, the most damaging type of short-term rental is that home in a residential community that was a residential home either for purchase or for long-term rental that has now been converted to only a short-term rental accommodation. So what are the two primary effects here we see? For my sociology nerds in the room, a bit of a Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, right? Society and community. It affects the social aspect and the community economic housing aspect. So socially, this is far more beyond markets, right? Is we have these effects that we can very much feel in our homes, in our communities, as we walk through the community, as we enjoy our home, as we sleep at night. The noise and traffic that typically comes along with someone who's staying somewhere is an accommodation on a vacation or a trip. It creates potential local nuisances in that way. It displaces people, which is probably the thing we think of most, maybe, is either directly through unit conversion. So you're renting a home, and the owner says, I'm going to sell this. And the investor comes in and says, well, I'm going to buy this. And now it's a short-term rental, get out. Okay. Or the other, a little bit slower way is they're just simply priced out. As more homes become short-term rentals in a community or a neighborhood, the price of those homes, the rents increases to the point where someone can now no longer afford to rent that home and they must move out. And that changes the neighborhood significantly. It commercializes neighborhoods in very extreme conditions. And we'll see that the impacts are different across the spectrum. So in extreme conditions, it can commercialize a residential neighborhood, or now rather than the community of folks living in their homes, living their lives, you've got a community of people who some of them live their lives, but many more of them come and go on a daily basis and they're transient. And that damages the social structures of the neighborhoods. And the biggest thing of all of that is not knowing who you're next door to, not understanding who is now living next to you. That person consistently, constantly changes, and it creates great social anxiety at times. It can likely lead to a breakdown of neighborhood collective efficacy, which is the positive feelings that people have about their community and the way they protect it, and the kind of positive feelings they get from it. This leads to all kinds of things. Suddenly, you start to distrust that neighbor who owns that home. You distrust the visitors. You automatically view them negatively. As soon as someone shows up at the house, you go, "Oh man, here they are! Some more noise again." That character of the community starts to kind of dissipate. This place where folks were buying short-term rentals and wanting to rent in there and experience the neighborhood, suddenly it moves from being this very real, very visceral experience to almost like the simulacra, this simulated experience of a maybe historic district or a community that is no longer having the same feeling. And what happens there is now suddenly you're giving no leeway for any nuisances to the neighbor that you don't know. Whereas the guy next door you knew, they were making noise. You go knock on his door and say, "Hey, can you keep it down tonight? Like, I know you're having a party, but we're trying to sleep." And they would say, "Okay, I'm sorry." In this instance, that's just a bunch of people who are coming and going and renting, and now there's no leeway. Now you're calling the police as soon as they they slam the doors too hard, right? So it's creating additional stress on you, the community, and services. And then it changes housing too, right? So aside from the social aspect, which is much more felt, much more maybe softer, it's a very real hard effect on housing. Unsurprisingly, it removes houses from the market, right? If a house was for purchase or for long-term rent, and you make it a short-term rental, that house is no longer available for housing for a person who wants to live in that community. Less inventory, higher prices. In areas where there's high demand, that's magnified, right? It also then increases the cost of housing in rents and then in raw prices. The asterisk here is that it's highly regionalized, even between neighborhoods. So a lot of short-term rentals in an area don't necessarily mean increased housing prices in the same way throughout the whole region or even throughout adjacent neighborhoods. And we'll talk about that a little bit. As a bonus here on the bottom, in high tourism and low-income areas, investors come in, purchase those homes, and it prices out locals who are by relatively wealthier tourists, right? And we call that touristification. It's a completely made up word that was used to describe this, similar to gentrification, just on a tourist basis. You saw that happen in the recession in Greece and Portugal when they had financial issues. Lisbon and Athens, specifically in those countries, opened up their neighborhoods to short-term rentals, to tourism as a way to generate revenue for countries that were having a rough go at it. And now, of course, that they've recovered. Now we're seeing major housing issues in communities in Portugal and Greece and even in Spain and Italy as well, where you have all these short-term rentals. It's currently happening in some South American cities and in the lower income, relatively lower income European Union cities, Budapest and Hungary, Bucharest and Romania, where the economies were slower to recover or blossom than the larger EU countries, and now they're using short-term rentals as a way to buoy things, and said they're going to run into these housing issues as they already are. So we have all of that. How does that happen, right? We'll get a little academic, and I'm going to blow through this because that's a big deal, and it's a lot to understand, but it's important. It's the rent gap. If I have any economists in the room, you know what this is, or any planning nerds like me, you probably also recognize this. It operates across the life cycle of housing. What happens is you build new housing, the rents are high. As it ages, the rent decreases. During that aging process, the land value tends to fluctuate and go down as well, with typically with the rent decreasing. At some point, that rent falls below a threshold where reinvestment becomes profitable. So the properties are then redeveloped, rent increases back to near the maximum, the property value again is increased significantly, and that cycle begins again. It's related to the highest and best use. Investment in surrounding properties tends to fluctuate that as well. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, but generally this is a good idea to abide by when we're talking about the change in value of housing. It ignores those things that are really important. Housing is a commodity, constraint disadvantage, structural racism. It does ignore those things. Those things also operate in the space. We're looking strictly at the economic value. So what happens is touristification enters, right? It supercharges gentrification. It literally is the rent gap taking large amounts of steroids. But you only see it in areas where there's a high demand. This doesn't just happen everywhere, and we'll talk about that. And that happens because short-term rentals are really easy to set up and really easy to flip. You don't have to rebuild anything. You don't have to build anything new. You just buy the home, furnish it, clean it up, and now you have a short-term rental in an area where there's demand. So this image on the right shows the typical rent gap, where income on the bottom is up, 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 then it decreases. Need potential income bifurcates at some point, and this gap develops. So what happens then is everything moves left, and I've exaggerated this a bit to show, but potential income with STRs, short-term rentals, increases dramatically. That rent gap then is still low. The gap becomes really high, and oh my God, who would have guessed, right, that this would happen? So what does that mean on the ground? For those of us like me who really like looking at data, there's a couple of examples here that I really want to go through. So we look at large cities. There was a study of large cities that was done. San Francisco, Chicago, Austin, and Boston. What they found in those communities was that anywhere from 30% to 44% of all listings were owned by folks who had more than one listing. And what does that mean? That means that it's not just your person who is renting out their home. on a basis of being away in the weekends or going on vacation, having someone there while they're gone, or even renting out extra space in their home. What you're finding in that instance, based on that data, is that someone owns multiple homes, or more likely, some corporation owns multiple homes, and they're renting those homes out on a short-term rental basis, probably full-time, okay, which has a significant effect, as we'll see, on our housing markets and our communities, because they're very different. Is an asterisk there, owners with multiple listings had an average of 3 to 3.5 listings. So half of the people who had more than one listing owned more than 3.5 listings. Okay, so it's not just someone who owns a second home even in the same community that, oh, I got through this home, now we moved into a bigger home, let's rent it out as a short-term rental. Now what happened is that people started gobbling up property. Now they own multiple ones. Now they're renting them on a short-term basis. Other studies, as I said, found the effect is widespread, yes, to an extent, but it's also hyper localized. In Berlin, for example, and you'll see a lot of these are located in big cities or in Europe or in high tourism areas, and that's because that's where short-term rentals, as we'll talk about, tend to pop up. In Berlin, one neighborhood in Berlin, 7% of all homes were short-term rentals. In Barcelona, about a sixth, so the entire city of Barcelona. A sixth of the apartments in the tourist center district of Barcelona were Airbnb. And if you know anything about places like Barcelona, apartments make up the vast majority of housing. In Los Angeles, as an American example, half of short-term rentals were in 7 neighborhoods alone. And then in Boston, some housing price information, we see that there was an average increase of 3.1% in rents based on the presence of short-term rentals. But even places that are relatively rural, that have low vacancy or few housing options, tend to feel that effect. So there's a study done in rural Oregon of 237 cities that had less than 100,000 residents. Those cities accounted for 44% of all Airbnbs or short-term rentals in the state of Oregon. And 70% of the listings were for an entire home. Again, not someone just renting out part of their home they're not using, an entire home. A couple more small points of data that are really helpful in kind of centering us on this idea. A big thing is, and this is something you see usually in larger cities or cities that have kind of historical or cultural significance, is they depopulate city centers. So, for example, in Rome and in Venice, the concentration of short-term rentals correlated very strongly with depopulation in those areas. So what's happening is, just like I talked about, those investors are coming in and purchasing up properties, whether they're homes, apartments, or condominiums, places people would usually live, as close to the city center as they can get, where they can get the highest rent. It becomes fiscally a good idea for them to go in and say, hey, I am going to purchase these homes in the center of town because they fetch the highest short-term rental rents. Okay, much higher than I'd get from a traditional rent, and it makes purchasing the home, it makes it make sense. So you start to get a concentration of short-term rentals, and what happens then is folks get pushed out of the city center. In New Zealand, in Queenstown, which is a smaller community, they saw impacts there related to parking, noise, traffic, and trash pickup. More of those social impacts rather than just those based specifically on housing costs and availability. In southern Spain along the coast, short-term rentals tended to spread readily from city centers near destinations like beaches, which becomes important as we talk about this. And they can lead to additional construction of new homes, but what happens is now you've got a community that's really, really popular with outsiders, especially in a lower income community relative to the rest of the country or the area. If you build new homes, they'll be unaffordable for the locals based on the market value, based on the ability to get revenue of the builders. So folks tend to buy those homes who aren't from the area, and you're not helping at all, right? What you need is strategic and purposeful and intentional affordable housing projects. So we won't get, like I said, into hyper-specific examples, what we're going to talk about, but I think it's really important to know that digital nomads is this kind of newer thing. And something I didn't necessarily touch on in my research, but they've tended to make this problem worse because they're purchasing housing in previously lower tourism areas that tends to be safer from short-term rentals. So it's having the same effect in a different way. It's increasing rents and increasing housing prices and making housing more scarce in these areas that really weren't tourism hotspots before. So where do they pop up, right? Where do short-term rentals come from? They don't appear out of thin air. They don't appear just anywhere. There needs to be the right conditions for short-term rentals. One or two in an area is not indicative of any problem. But you start to get larger concentrations, and there's usually a driver for that, right? There's usually something that makes folks want to visit a place, because at the end of the day, a short-term rental is most likely geared towards someone who is on vacation, who is on a leisure trip. It can be geared towards business, but typically it's that vacationer. So within tourist destinations, and I tried to pull some very Ohio-centric ones here. Geneva on the Lake is a good example up on Lake Erie in Ashtabula County. They will get, it's a small community of 1,000 people or less. So there's not a lot of housing stock. And what we've seen happen is Airbnbs have propagated significantly in the last 10 to 15 years, because it's close to a very popular tourist destination there in Geneva on the Lake. Moderate price neighborhoods near tourist destinations. So Victorian or Italian Village in Columbus is a good example. Adjacent to the more expensive, Grandview Heights or Short North, but still close enough to that action, close enough to, in this case, the destination would be the Ohio State University or the stadium on game day. So still close enough to be to those places that are higher priced or desirable, but maybe more moderate than the Short North, for example. Nearest tourist attractions. So Sandusky, Port Clinton, right? Cedar Point's right up there. The islands are up there. Short-term rentals are going to pop up close to those spaces where folks can access either one or multiple tourist destinations. In areas lacking traditional accommodations. If you're ever on the Lake Erie Islands in Put-in Bay, there are a few hotels, last I checked, but they're not as widespread. So the Lake Erie Islands in those areas will have short-term rentals. And you see that also in Hocking Hills, for example, where there's a lack of traditional accommodations. You'll see that in the wine areas of kind of Lake County, Ashtabula County, where folks will rent out their homes as short-term rentals because there's a lack of hotels. And hotels are, they take time and expense to set up, whereas a short-term rental, like I said, is relatively easy. So someone can come in and provide that accommodation service very easily, rather than the years it takes to stand up a traditional hotel. Proximal to transit. Ohio doesn't have much transit, right? I say this a bit tongue in cheek, but relatively it's true to most places that have more robust transit. But you'll see short-term rentals pop up in tourist areas near rail, BRT, bus, railway, subway stations. Proximal to amenities. German Village, Short North in Columbus, Ohio City and Cleveland, for example. Places that are close to those things that folks want to do. And then you may not have heard of this before, but the NAR areas or gateway and natural amenity regions, short-term rentals pop up close to or within those areas. So folks can be close to nature, because obviously you can't have hotels within a state park or a national park or, challenging terrain, but you can have a home or a cabin just outside of there. And I think, many of us have been to, or at least heard of, Logan and Hocking Hills and that area without really any hotels. So you see a lot of short-term rentals, a lot of cabins for rent. An important note here, short-term rentals don't just appear out of nowhere. They're not the boogeyman, not the housing boogeyman. They're not going to come steal your house and flip it to a short-term rental. There has to be a bit of demand for that to occur. Has to be something drawing folks there. And I say usually, needs to be a lack of traditional tourist infrastructure. You will see places that do have a ton of tourist infrastructure, like traditional hotels and motels and hostels, with short-term rentals, but those will be in your really, really high demand areas. And it will be maybe based on surges, or they'll be really seasonal or cyclical. So I think of sporting events, for example. Ohio State football games would probably be a good one, where on those 5, 6, 7 Saturdays where they're having a game there in Columbus, my guess is short-term rentals are probably a lot more pervasive on those weekends than they would regularly be. But I want you to take away from this that short-term rentals aren't going to pop up everywhere, and you don't need to be concerned that they're going to be everywhere all the time. They need some moderately specific conditions to actually pop up and actually begin to propagate. But they're not all equal. I know it couldn't be that easy. Don't leave. It's not that simple. There's a lot of moving parts to this. They're not equal. We need to think about how we're classifying these and what they look like, because two Airbnbs next to each other or short-term rentals are not the same. There's things that make them different. It comes down to how often it's rented out and how much of it is rented out. Those are the two primary key factors. Homeowner presence is part of that as well, and that affects kind of the impact and the way it's rented out and the way it's treated. So it's related. Typically three types you get. You have your entire home, your ADU, or your specific room. But I have news for you. That's a really big oversimplification. There's things between those classes, and there's descriptors within those classes that change the impact and change the way that we need to regulate them. Because that's really the important thing is are they regulated, and do we need to regulate them? Because as I'll talk about in a little bit here, we don't all need to regulate short-term rentals. We don't want to write code just to write code. We don't need a zoning, kind of a chapter in our zoning code just for the heck of it, right? We need to make sure we're actually legislating something or regulating something that requires regulation. So we have all types of short-term rentals, from less disruptive to more disruptive, but also from residential to commercial, right? And that goes from left to right. I'm sure my colleagues are laughing at me because I'm very far from a graphic designer here, and this slide is probably upsetting them. Partial home part-time. I would argue the original intent of Airbnb is the least disruptive, most residential use. And you see that moves to the right, to all the way to the right-hand side, which I would call maybe the worst case scenario, which is a whole home or all year rental with a guest house or an ADU on site and no property owner there, right? There's a strong argument that that's a commercial property, right? That's a commercial hotel property. But you've got all these things in between, and how do we deal with them, right? A whole home part-time is different than a whole home all year. And if you throw an ADU in there or a basement apartment, guest house, then it becomes even more different, right? Is it one unit on site? Is it 3 units on site? Those things matter when we talk about regulation, because we're regulating the part-time, part-home one very differently than we are the one that's on the market all year where the owner doesn't live there and they're renting the whole house. Those things have different, they have different aspects of them, different impacts, and they require different regulation. If we're blanket regulating every short-term rental on the market regardless, then we're doing it wrong. We're not serving anybody, and we're just regulating just for the purpose of regulating, which, just like zoning for the purpose of zoning when there's no rational need for it, it's probably not good, right? But it's not all bad, right? I don't want to paint this as this really negative thing, right? Because short-term rentals can be good. We can look at these types and we can probably infer that some of these have positives to them, that they do offer something to the community. So I don't want you to walk away from this and say, well, short-term rentals are the devil, they're horrible, they just destroy communities, because that's not entirely the case. They need to be regulated and we need to watch them carefully. And when they get to the point of maybe being a problem, we need to think about what our regulations look like. Or if we think there's potential, we need to probably regulate ahead of that. But they do bring positive things to the table, and I want you to understand that. So they provide a viable tax base for communities, especially when we look at smaller rural spaces. Again, I'll go back to Logan, Ohio, or I'll go back to Geneva on the Lake, places that were more rural and didn't have a whole lot of folks coming to them, didn't have traditional accommodations, as it were. But even just aside from that individual short-term rental there, those people they're bringing in support businesses, right? They go eat at restaurants, they visit businesses, they use recreational operators, they do all kinds of stuff. They buy gas, they buy groceries, everything, right? So they're supporting tourism in that sense. They're supporting the community through taxes. Those owners who own those properties, assuming they're not corporations, that revenue helps those owners stay in their homes, right? It helps them to obtain income, to keep their house looking good, to be able to maybe age in place if it's an older couple or an older individual. As costs increase and Social Security is stagnant for them, being able to have the additional revenue to age in place and not have to move is a really big deal. It can really support the community. Something a lot of folks don't think about when it comes to short-term rentals is you're employing folks to come in most of the time to do things like clean the units, sometimes manage the units if you've got a lot of them, and maintain them. You're hiring people to clean the floors, to retile the bathroom, to paint the house, to landscape, but also just to clean when folks, come and go. I think we've all used Airbnb, and we know we get charged a cleaning fee, and usually that hopefully goes to someone actually coming in and cleaning the property. And that last one there, manage the units. I don't necessarily mean that in the sense of someone owns 40 units and they need a manager. What I mean by that is you go to some resort communities, we'll call them, or communities where there are a lot of short-term rentals, and you'll have one or two management companies that manage the short-term rentals for people. Maybe I own this home, but maybe I'm a snowbird. Maybe I'm gone on the weekends or something. I can contract a company so I don't have to deal with booking it and managing it and getting the cleaner there and getting the maintenance done, for example. They handle all of that. So there's another economy within that. Aside from those really great tax and job kind of incentives, they fill a void in accommodations. I think I mentioned this before. Buying a home or a home you already live in and renting it part-time is as easy as listing it on Airbnb or VRBO or whatever platform you use. You don't have to build a hotel, which, by the way, as we all know as planners, includes a lot of pre-work, site work, permitting, construction, getting your certificate of appropriateness, all these kinds of things. That takes a long time, and it's very expensive, whereas a short-term rental is quite easy to set up, which is the positive and the negative of it. They offer this seasonal ability. So a hotel typically can't survive if they can't get anyone to book during the season, right? If they're highly seasonal, if they're all full in the summer, but no one comes in the winter, tends to be a bit more of a challenge for them. Whereas, again, we'll use the example of a snowbird or someone who has a second home somewhere else and travels there. They can rent their home during the busy season and come back during the slow season. So it allows a lot of flexibility. And I think the biggest thing, and I think the reason why a lot of folks use Airbnbs, even just occasionally, is it provides for some additional accommodation. It's another option. If maybe you don't like all the hotels in the area, but you like an Airbnb, that's fine. Maybe you don't always use Airbnb, but sometimes you do when you travel to certain places, right? It gives you that additional option and helps to drive additional visitation. And then finally, collecting bed tax for the region. So we know municipalities in Ohio can't collect sales tax, but you can collect tax on overnight accommodations in most cases. You can levy a tax on hotel rooms and short-term rentals. Very important way, especially if your community has a large number of accommodations, to be able to achieve some income tax and do some things to help manage the issues that come along with it. Regulations are key. Locality is important. There's been the state has tried to preempt communities, not just in Ohio, but in other places. The state of Utah is another good example where the state has tried to come in and say, you may not ban these, you may not regulate them at all. You have to let them in and you can't permit them in any different way. Just kind of mandating from the state level. And we know in a lot of things that's not good, but in short-term rentals specifically, they have a hyper-local impact. So regulating them in a blanket way at the state level is not a great idea, and does not produce good outcomes. The number of short-term rentals, your community, your vulnerability, your type of folks will dictate how you regulate. I would say at the very least, you should be issuing some kind of zoning permit or business license to track those and collect the revenue. It's a big and collect the revenue. So when you do a zoning regulation or a use regulation on the short-term rentals, even if it's just putting it in your use table and making it applicable for a zoning permit, an administrative zoning permit, it should be accompanied by some kind of business regulation to say, hey, we know this exists, we know this is a business, let's at least collect tax on it. The answer, as in most cases, right, is never at opposite ends of this thing. It's never in a situation where outright ban or no regulation is good, right? That doesn't usually turn out well. In the case of an outright ban, if you've already got short-term rentals, we're wandering into Fifth Amendment territory, Nolan Dolan, regulatory taking, and nobody wants to get into that in that kind of mess of things. So outright bans, not great, very bad. Zero regulations, in most cases, if there are short-term rentals in the community, probably bad. Now, if you don't have any short-term rentals, you don't really need to regulate what you don't have. Biggest thing for me, and I've built short-term rental permitting programs in previous organizations, is a framework that encourages compliance. As planners or public administrators, we know that voluntary compliance is the absolute goal. You never want to send nasty letters or enforcement letters or just knock on somebody's door to try and coerce compliance or force compliance based on the code, right? You want to make sure that you're actually getting compliance voluntarily. Make your regulations really easy to navigate, okay? Yeah, they have to get the permit, they have to pay the fee. Make it clear, make it easy, make navigation simple so that you can get compliance voluntarily and don't have to go through the process of enforcement. It's much cleaner that way. So the reason you probably all showed up here today is how do we control these things? You probably were sleeping for the last 35 minutes, and that's okay. How do we control these? There are 5 big things that I look at when we control these. Ownership, so where the person lives, who owns it, the typology, the literal type of short-term rental we're dealing with, the zoning that's involved in regulating it, potential design guidelines, which you could argue are also zoning, but for the purpose of this presentation, we keep them separate. And then the geographical control. Okay, so there's 5 ways we look at this. Ownership. When we talk about ownership, we're talking about someone who lives there and owns the property. The best way to regulate this for the lowest impact is to write into your code. And you'll notice all these things also tend to relate back to your zoning code. Make it such that it must be the primary residence of the person who is renting the short-term rental. They must be on the permit. Their federal tax return or state ID must match the address they're renting as a short-term rental, which is a way to make sure that that's their primary residence. That will require annual verification. It can be a bit cumbersome, but in the past, that's how I've seen it done. That's how I've done it, and it tends to be very effective. If there's a listing agent, the owner should typically be the listing agent. That would preclude the use of a listing service. And you could potentially write into your code that they can use a listing service, but they must be the permit holder. And that way you can make sure that they hold no other permits within the community. The owner operator has to be a person, a live living person. It can't be an LLC or a holding company. It has to be a person who owns the permit, the property. Keep those things together. It keeps the owner on site, or at least keeps that as their primary residence. So it allows for snowbirds, right? So if you have someone who 185 days out of the year or 186 days out of the year, they're in their community in Ohio, but 180 days out of the year, they're in Arizona or Florida or somewhere where it's warm in the wintertime. So this is still their primary residence. They can still rent it on a short-term basis, but it's not the whole house all the time. So it's still somebody's home. We can look at typology, for example. Make sure I didn't skip one. Again, this is a gross simplification, but it kind of helps to lay out how we want to permit these based on types. So we look at occupancy type of these, okay? Year-round whole house, arguably a commercial property. High potential for impacts. We want to subject that to something that requires a bit more investigation. Conditional use is a perfect example. So conditional use that hopefully has to go to your planning commission, where you put specific conditions on it to make sure they don't violate those. And then you can bring that conditional permit back upon violation and revisit it, right? Building in and stuff to your zoning code that allows for revocation of permit, which we'll talk about momentarily. If we're looking at a partial year whole house, for example, so like that snowbird, we could potentially develop a special use permit. That's an administrative process with additional stipulations or triggers. Maybe there's something in your zoning code that says, short-term rentals that are partially your whole house are, an administrative special use permit unless A, B, or C, and then it goes to planning commission. We look at year-round partial house, so someone, who just lives in the house full-time, and they're renting the basement or one of the rooms. Potentially look at that as just a business license or a zoning permit, purely administrative. It's no different than your mother-in-law staying with you, your father-in-law staying with you, your siblings staying with you. The only difference is the exchange of money. And then partial house, part-time. There's argument as to whether or not you actually need or want to track and regulate these. I think for the purpose of, if it's a listed short-term rental on a platform, it's probably important to at least know what's out there. But there's discussion as to whether or not you actually need to do anything. I would suggest a zoning permit at the very least. But again, nothing here is innately different from your friend staying with you for a week while they visit. The only difference, again, just like year-round partial houses, is an exchange of money. We also can look at number of units. We talk about permitting specifically, controlling ownership residency requirements, which again, you'll see a lot of cross contamination, if you will, with the different types of regulations we're talking about, because they all do have to go hand in hand and they have to agree with each other. They're not cleanly bucketized like I have shown them. A permanent resident property owner with one unit. Okay, a main dwelling and one or more ADUs without an owner, you might have some issues. So looking at how many short-term rental units are on site there. If that person, like this says, has an ADU or a guest house or a basement apartment, which are all ADUs, but just different kind of types, those might bring much more of a problem than you just renting your home. Maybe you have an ADU, but you live in the ADU and you rent the main house. That's probably okay. It maybe just needs a regular, maybe conditional use or zoning permit. Zoning should control for properties with more than 2 short-term dwelling units, because then I think we have probably crossed into commercial territory when we have 2 short-term rental properties, essentially 2 hotel rooms on a property. But that is a heated discussion consistently as to whether or not that's commercial or residential. Always look at if it fits the intent of your zoning district. Is it harmonious with other uses? So zoning regulations. We talked about conditional use permits, special use permits, zoning permits, business licenses, anything related to permitting. This really is important. We look at zoning. We're going to go here beyond the types of permitting and actually how your zoning should look. You want to include avenues for enforcement, conditions of holding that permit, avenues for revocation of permit, escalating penalties, from fines within a certain amount of time all the way up to losing your permit, getting bumped at the back of the line, never being able to apply again, these kinds of things. Punitive measures have got to be part of it. You've got to look at that fine structure and the potential loss of permit. You've got to coordinate with your police department, because you want to know when there's been emergency response out there. You want to know when the police have been called, when a crime has been committed, when there's been an arrest, because those things should have triggers within your zoning code as it relates to your short-term rentals. You'll need to account for those things like police activity, like criminal activity, calls for service, but also trash, also noise. And also you'll want to make sure that within your code, there's a requirement for the owner to immediately respond in some or all situations. This can have a way of ensuring that your property owner lives close or lives there. Because when there's an emergency situation or there's a criminal activity, there's police service or someone's been arrested, you need the owner right out there right now to deal with it. You can look at zoning in the very Euclidean sense, where STR is only allowed in certain districts. Maybe you relate that to typology. It's probably not a bad idea. Look at parking requirements. Parking requirements can be a great way to limit the size, as can occupancy. Tie that to parking. Maybe only 4 people in a short-term rental. Maybe only parking for 2 cars. Some way to, or making sure parking is required for all permits or all visitors, that they can't park on the street. Is a good way to try and limit the nuisance factor from a short-term rental. And then the permitting process. I talked about this a moment ago, making sure it's obviously accessible, but very clear. Make sure that whatever you put out to the public in terms of your permitting process is very clear on what you need, what they're required to do, and lays out the steps in a way that they can understand. As we know, when it comes to permitting and development review, as soon as you start throwing extra steps in or start surprising applicants, they will either throw a fit or they will just stop complying, which is not what we want to happen. And then within the permitting process, depending on how popular or how few or many short-term rentals you have, you should plan for a wait list and build a system as to how that works. You should account for that within the zoning regulation, but also build a separate system for how you're going to deal with that, how you're going to track wait list individuals, how you're going to insert them, how you're going to give them permits, how you're going to make sure that it's fair. That's going to be really important, is the fairness aspect of it. Finally, design guidelines, very similar to zoning, yes, but slightly different. We're looking at the design, the signage, info placement of the owner, a bit of maintenance as well. I know a lot of that falls under zoning. The biggest thing here is ensuring via entrances and signage that it looks like a regular single family home or whatever the typical home is within that neighborhood. We don't want it standing out so that, oh, this is clearly a short-term rental because it's got a giant sign on the front and it's got 3 front doors. It's got 2 driveways, right? Now we want to make sure that we're controlling for that design so that if there's a short-term rental, you can't tell it's there, right? And that's, I think, what most, in my experience, what most people want who live near short-term rentals is they want to not know it's there. They want it to just be another house. Maybe they just don't know the owner of it. As soon as it starts to look like a short-term rental and create those problems, that's when you run into issues with the community and with complaints. That's what we don't want to have happen. And then finally, geography. Again, related to zoning. We can look at this a couple of different ways. We can look at this through density. And let's look at a block, for example. So 3 short-term rentals per block is an example. These numbers, by the way, completely made up. They're not guidelines. Don't take them away and say, hey, well, Daryl said these are our guidelines. No, these are just notional numbers. We can look at percentage of units. So maybe a percentage of dwelling types, maybe 5% of all single family units or 1% of all attached residential, some way to track that ratio. You can a percentage of dwelling units and make it within a zoning district. It's also geographical and zoning at the same time. Again, a lot of crossover. And then you can just look at straight up number of units in an area. 10 short-term rentals per ward or per precinct or per communication area, however you want to set it up. You can use city council districts. You can create your own districts. You can go to the police department for their patrol districts, however you want to do it. I would say there's no best practice. These are in themselves best practices, of course, but there's no best one to pick. It's all based on your local conditions and sort of on the ground and how many, what your housing looks like, what your tourism looks like, how many short-term rentals there actually are. So you can start to get your handle on these. The important thing too is when you enact regulations, you'll need to make sure that you account for all of the short-term rentals that are already occurring. So you need to make enough permits to cover all those short-term rentals, or you need to stipulate such that, hey, there's only 100 permits, but there's 200 units. Understand that you're all grandfathered in. You all keep your permits as long as you maintain them according to the zoning code, according to regulations. But as soon as you abandon that permit, you then cannot get it back until it drops below the requisite number of permits. So I'm still doing okay on time here. How do I know if I have STRs? There's no test, okay? They're really hard to find. Or sorry, they're not hard to find. They're really hard to locate. You can get on Airbnb like I have on the right-hand side here and Google, I put in Geneva on the Lake here and it popped up with like 200 short-term rentals. So not hard to find them, but locating them is a different story. Where are they exactly at? The platforms will all mask the real location. To keep folks, they do that under the guise of protecting homes from break-ins. In reality, it's protecting the location from, local zoning enforcement. At least that's my experience. The very astute short-term rental operators will never show the outside in a way that you can identify where it is or the address. Not all operators, of course, are that astute. Maybe they don't care. Sometimes you'll see straight up an address on there, and that's fine, I guess. So how do you find them? You got to scrape the listings, and there's some listing sites out there like AirDNA where you can get on there and kind of see the pictures, but it still won't tell you the exact location. But the better thing to do is search based on your local knowledge. Look at the pictures, and if there's one picture of the front of the house, or you look out the
Well, folks, I don't know what happened to poor Daryl. I think he is trying to maybe fix an internet situation.
Yeah,
Let's just give him. Oh, there. Oh,
I'm here.
hi.
My VP,
Where did you go?
my VPN just said you're enough internet today, and that's what it did. So
Well, you need to have conversation with him then.
it just said nope, you're done. So yeah. All right. Sorry about that, everybody. That was
That's
excitement.
okay. Can you try to reshare your screen
I
too?
would love to do that.
And
Yes.
maybe we just won't see your face. Maybe keep your camera off just to save bandwidth, just to be safe.
I'll try not to take offense to that, Christine.
Right? There was no other way to say it.
Yeah, let's see. All right, cool. There we go. I will go back to share.
I almost had to start singing just to keep everyone's attention.
Oh,
I mean,
at least I could tell.
At
least I could tell that it was like I was not on there anymore because my headphones went dead.
Ah,
I could
that'll
just
do
start
it.
screaming into the void a little bit longer as I wait for my computer to pull up the presentation here. There we go. Can we all see that?
Um, let's see. I don't see it.
Let's see. I'm going to share. Oh, because I had to hit share. That's really important.
If you would.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go. There. Okay. So now I should be able to. See that?
Yep. Just put it into like a presentation mode. All right. I am satisfied. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Anyways, so you know, you need to scrape most in the local knowledge to find it. Demographics can really help you find them. If you look at a lot of different things that we'll see here momentarily, to try and find where your short-term rentals are at. But all I did was pull this up and kind of, it's easy to see where the short-term rentals are at. It's hard to actually locate exactly where they might be. But there's a few keys to tell if you have short-term rentals. So let's look at an Ohio-based example. I'm using Geneva on the Lake as a good example. So if we look at their population, it has really changed over the last 23 years or so, almost half the population it used to be. In that picture on the right is the very glorious strip of Geneva on the Lake. So population has decreased. Okay, that doesn't necessarily lend itself to short-term rentals, now does it? But I used airroi.com, which is a really weird collection of looking letters, but it's true. What I found there, and you can see on the right, is every red dot there is a short-term rental. Roughly 200, okay, short-term rentals. It's an easy way to tell. Absent of kind of some of that information, we can go down the census rabbit hole, which we know is moderately accurate, but at least it gives a clue. So 1,150 housing units, roughly unchanged, slightly down from 2000. But the key there is the vacant housing units. 60% of housing units were vacant. It's quite a lot, up from 46% in 2000. Okay, well, that was still kind of a lot back then. Difference of about 150. What we find is that within those, that kind of vacancy data in table B 25004 from the census, is that there's vacant on a part-time or vacation basis. And that can be a proxy for short-term rentals or vacation rentals. Again, it's not hard and fast, especially in a small community. It's going to be high fluctuation within that number, but you're going to get a good idea for how many there are based on some of that information. So absent of Airbnb information, you can kind of look at the census data and say, oh, we might have a problem here. Why are all these houses showing up as vacant for kind of seasonal residential use? So you would think based on this number of units that Geneva on the Lake is probably past the point of stringent resolutions or regulations without some really significant legal challenges based on regulatory takings, which again, no fun. So I managed to, even with a technology goof up, come in under time, which I am going to pat myself on the back for that one. Let's see, I can, my video, there we go, look at that. So our short-term rental is bad. I don't think Larry knows either, but I don't know. So yes and no. And that's what I'll leave you with because everyone likes a really clear answer, right? This is my contact information. That QR code there, because I'm really cool and technologically savvy, if you take a picture of it, it will start an email to me about short-term rentals. So you can do that, or you can just copy and paste the email on the bottom there. There's my cell phone and office phone number there on the left. So if you have any questions about short-term rentals or this presentation or life itself, just reach out.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you have questions for Daryl, you can do all the things to get a hold of him. Would you like to do a plug for your session at our state planning conference?
Yes, we're doing a session at the state planning conference, I believe also on short-term rentals. It'll be a little bit more updated with some good information. And it'll be in person. And I'm much better in person than I am on the internet. And I also don't drop because the VPN drops in person.
Well, we'll see. You never know.
Right. And I'll have other people with me. So it's not just me talking at you for an hour. There'll be other people to talk at you too. And then you can ask questions. So I encourage you to come see us. I think it's on Friday. That's on the last, I think the last day, the last session. So don't go home the last day, last session. Like,
well,
come
I
see us
always
first.
drop the most popular, important sessions at the very end to make sure everyone stays till the very end.
Oh, you're too nice.
All right, folks. Well, thank you. It doesn't look, I don't see any questions. That means that you clearly answered everyone's questions before they came up with them. So,
Right.
but if you do think of anything, you can contact Daryl directly or stop by and see him when you come to the state conference this fall. We are recording this. We will post it onto our Ohio chapter YouTube channel. We'll also have it on our website. You'll get an email, all the things, so that you can share this out to colleagues and those that you think might be interested. So thank you, Daryl, for spending this lunch hour with us. We appreciate you.
Yeah.
And everyone, hey, have a great day. And hopefully we'll see some of you here in September. And don't forget to submit a session proposal to the Miami Valley Planning and Zoning Workshop. And you can get all that info on our website, ohioplanning.org. All right. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, everybody. Have a good
Thank
one.
you.
Bye.
Bye.